Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Episode 8, Teacher Education with Professor Trevor Mutton.
Welcome back, everyone, to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching. Today we have a special guest, a guest who I have no shame in telling you we've been trying to get on this podcast for a while. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Trevor Mutton, Professor at Oxford University. Welcome. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
Very pleased to have you. And you're here to talk to us today about an article, but around an article that you co-authored with two colleagues. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that article, you are based in England.
Yes.
And the initial teacher education climate landscape is quite different where you're at the moment. And it's something that we need to talk about that sort of sets the context of this article. So just tell us a little bit about what's been going on in recent years in teacher education in England, if you will.
Okay, it's a bit of a long story, and it's thinking how far to go back with this. But I suppose it's starting in 2010 when the coalition government came into office and set about major reforms of initial teacher education, and particularly this move towards school-led teacher education, and the sense that teachers needed to take more, or have more, schools have more responsibility for educating teachers because they knew the sort of teachers that they needed to employ, therefore should be more actively involved in the preparation of those teachers, which, we've never had a problem with that point of view. And so new things were put in place, such as the school direct model, the significant increase in the number of school-centred initial teacher training providers. In 2015-16, there was a review of initial teacher education that I think in retrospect turns out to have been very, very influential. It was the Carter Review carried out by Sir Andrew Carter, working with a small team of people, and they made a number of recommendations, one of which was that there should be a core content because they had identified an apparent variability and in terms of particularly, content and quality across provision. And so that triggered, there was an initial core content framework that was very closely aligned to the teachers' standards, and various other things like a set of mentoring standards and such like. Roll forward a bit, and various changes of Secretary of State for Education, but eventually this recruitment and retention policy, part of which was to provide more support for induction and the move towards a 2-year induction program and an early career framework, which set the what early career teachers needed to know and how they would learn these things. Then the argument was, and the idea was it would build on the strengths of initial teacher education. The argument was then, if we've got an early career framework, we should then have a core content framework for initial teacher education. Or, as the government in England always, they will never talk about initial teacher education. They will only ever talk about initial teacher training and ITT. So the core content framework for ITT, which was modelled exactly on the early career framework and designate, must learn that and learn how to. And then supported by a set of references that, various people have identified as being sort of quite limited and all coming from, particularly coming from, the cognitive science sort of influenced literature. Anyhow, then another review was set in place that coincided with sort of COVID, so it was held up a bit, but then eventually published, which was much more sort of sweeping reforms, and said that all programs needed to be reaccredited by the government, or to be accredited, because it wasn't a reaccreditation process. They had to be accredited by the government, that it would be an application process, submission of the accreditation sort of document, and all programs had to show fidelity to the core content framework. That had to be the minimum requirement. And you can see, if there were this variability, then you can see why somebody might think that, all programs must follow the same sort of minimum requirements as an entitlement for all student teachers. I think I need to say probably that I think at the point of the market review recommendations being implemented, all teacher education programs, whether they were university programs or SCITs, school-centred initial teacher training programs, had been deemed to be either good or outstanding. So Ofsted found no problem with any teacher education programs. But there was this counter-narrative that they weren't preparing teachers properly for school, for what schools wanted, etc., and that narrative seemed to prevail. So we had a market review process that required all providers to seek accreditation. That was done there were two opportunities to do that, two deadlines. One, I think, was in the February or January or February, one in the June. Anybody who went for the first one and didn't succeed was given the chance to apply for accreditation. As a result of that process, I think it was something like a third of providers, university providers and SCIT providers, did not achieve accreditation. And there was an appeals process, and not a single one of those providers actually, the appeal was upheld. They all lost their accreditation. And so as a result, many of those now, some are really, like significant providers. I'm not going to list all the universities, but when you're talking things like the University of Durham, University of East Anglia, I think it's University of Sussex, West of England, a lot of these providers lost their accreditation. Brunel, another one, and a significant number of SCITs. And so those universities, the only option for them has been to either shut up shop or to work in partnership with a university or a SCIT provider that has achieved accreditation. I won't go into all the detail of the machinations around that, but given some of the original recommendations, they were toned down a little, but we've all had to go through this process. The second stage stage 2, was that the accredited providers, or the ones deemed to receive accreditation, had to then submit very detailed teaching materials for very specific core content framework areas. And we're talking about detailed down to PowerPoints with notes, and then they were scrutinized by the Department for Education, and we were given feedback on those, and some had to be sent back and said, you haven't actually addressed this, 3.7 in slide number 22. It was at that level. Anyhow, that whole process has been gone through, and the new programs began in September 2024.
I suppose I should at this point say that I'm quite guilty on this podcast. You probably know this, Emma, from sitting opposite me. I'm quite guilty of making kind of throwaway comments about over the border, things are difficult, things are adversarial, people maybe not on the same side and to the same extent as perhaps they would appear to be in Wales. I wouldn't want to suggest that everything in the garden is absolutely perfect in Wales by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a generalised sort of quite adversarial feel about the education world over in England. And it's not just initial teacher training, as they call it, but just all sorts of things about the way that Ofsted go about their business. That's obviously been hugely in the news, about just a general kind of sense from the government. I know Michael Gove is ancient history now, isn't he? But all that stuff about the blob and all that kind of thing. To what extent do you think that all of that kind of behaviour towards university, teacher education, faculties or providers is down to just a general kind of adversarial stance by the Westminster government, as was, towards the education in general? And to what extent do you feel it is a philosophical position that they just don't actually see teaching as a thing that universities need to be getting involved with?
Yeah, that's quite a complicated question. A lot of it, I think, is driven by a narrative that's been there since the 1980s, that university teacher education was basically worthless academics in ivory towers, teaching stuff that was not relevant, particularly, disciplinary knowledge, sociology, philosophy, psychology, that type of thing that wasn't relevant to the classroom. I think it was, and that what teachers needed were, practical skills to be able to get in there and be classroom ready, so to speak. And when you track that back, you can see where that had come from, because, a long, long while ago, when teacher training colleges were, became subsumed into universities, when teaching became a graduate profession, and those colleges changed, and it became a degree entry profession with a postgraduate certificate of education, and it became academized. And then I think a lot of universities thought then, in order for it to be valid within, the academy, it had to have heft, and therefore these programs were constructed around, including a lot of this theoretical input. And then they were deemed to be less relevant. It's interesting, I think we say, the paper we'll talk about in a moment, that sort of, conversely, teacher education is criticised for being too theoretical and then not theoretical enough. You can't sort of win. So I think that continued, and through really influential reports such as the Policy Exchange report that came out, I think, in 2009, 2010, just before the government were elected, that clearly influenced, Michael Gove's thinking. Whether there was, a genuine desire to make teacher education more relevant by including, schools much more in that process. At Oxford, our programme has always done that. That's why we didn't find any of this a particular problem, the move towards more school-centred teacher education. We'd always had that. It had been an integral part of our model from the beginning. So I think there was a need, some need for that. But the problem is that it was like everybody was seen to be a problem, and everything was dealt with in this very, I think, top-heavy way. And certainly the market review is this idea that everybody should have the same training, not that, you could have variation and still have quality of outcomes, but that it was very much the minimum requirement. Not the minimum requirement, but the essential requirement, and really that you were not expected to go beyond that. I think that's the thing that people have found so difficult, that it will confuse the poor things if they're given, too much other stuff to think about, and not to problematize it, but you actually equip them with, particular skills that they can then replicate in the classroom without taking any account of the complexity of teachers' decision-making and what they need to draw on in order to make those decisions in the moment, and more generally when they're planning, for example.
And I suppose a problem that emerges in the article that we're going to talk about now is the fact that economic metrics globally have been used to determine the sort of quality of and therefore the best approach to teacher training. I'm saying with air quotation marks because I prefer teacher education for reasons that we'll get into. And actually have sidelined, the actual research evidence that comes from the profession itself.
Yeah.
As a means of understanding how teachers learn and therefore how best to educate them, to train them. And also the paper sort of sets within this context a little bit of a sort of tap on the wrist, really, that, well, you don't seem to have your own story straight about what it means to be a teacher and to enter into that profession, to learn within that profession. So if you haven't got your story straight, we'll do it for you, and we'll figure it out, and we'll scrutinise your paperwork and tell you if you're doing it right or doing it wrong. And I'm obviously reducing it down a little bit here. But then entering into this space, we've got this excellent article that gave me so much to think about, entitled "Learning to Think, Perform and Act with Integrity. Does teacher education have a signature pedagogy, and why does it matter?" Now, when I saw signature pedagogy, I thought, I'm on common ground here, because my doctorate deals with the work of Lee Shulman, pedagogical content knowledge. So I've come across this concept of signature pedagogy. But perhaps you could give our listeners, Trevor, just a brief overview of that theory and how it's broken down and how it was applied in this article.
Okay, so Shulman has this idea that all professions have a signature pedagogy, and they are the things that are recognizable in the way in which professionals are prepared in order to enter that profession. And I think his research initially wasn't with teachers and teacher education. It was looking at things like lawyers, the clergy, nurses, and when you look at those, you can think, oh, yeah, it all makes sense. When you read, Shulman's work, you can see, yeah, definitely in a classroom where lawyers are being trained, there are particular approaches. The classroom looks a certain way. It's different to how it looks, a classroom for engineers being trained or whatever. And there are things that educators do, law educators do, and methods of approaching the content, the knowledge that quite traditional, have probably passed from generation to generation, and they are recognizable as signature pedagogies. So, and what he says is, his analysis says that they all have in common that it's about understanding, and what does he say? Teachers have to have the understandings in order to be, perform equitably. They have to know in order to be able to act. And he talks about these three levels: the surface level, the things that you see and would recognize as happening, in teaching situations; the deep level, which is the understanding of the knowledge base for that profession, the ways of working, and what's important to in terms of knowledge underpinning that profession. And then thirdly, the implicit level, which is about the values then that sort of drive the deeper level and then reflected in the surface level. And so I think what we were doing was looking at those surface, deep and implicit levels, and we took some examples of different approaches to teacher education. And I think the problem is that there is no one signature pedagogy for teacher education, not because in a way there is no sort of professional representative body. There are those bodies, but there is nobody that sort of holds the teaching profession, the knowledge, who determines that knowledge, determines the way at which teachers, responsible for teacher qualification other than the government. So I think that's different. And then seeing how models such as an apprenticeship model or a theory into practice model or whichever, clinical practice models, how they reflect a particular view, or are reflected in a surface level, what you do at the surface level, what you do at what they reflect in terms of the deeper level, and what they're saying about the values. And so you could take like the core content framework and see that as another example that, how would that be delivered? It would at the surface level, but what actually, it's not that saying that it hasn't got an underpinning rationale and an understanding of what teaching is and what teachers need to learn. And then, the underpinning values, what's implicit in that. And I suppose it's about what type of teacher we want to produce. That's what it comes down to. And that's difficult because there's no agreement on that, I don't think. And we may sit in our ivory towers thinking, well, this is the sort of teacher we want, but if schools say, well, actually, we want something different, it's difficult to reconcile those two. And I think we when we looked at some and said, well, some were very knowledge-centered, the idea that there is knowledge out there that has to be imparted to the novices, if that's, the beginning teachers, they have to acquire that knowledge by some means or another in order to be able to work as teachers, or some that were actually, we call them more sort of people-centered approaches that start with the individual and the assumption that they actually have the capacity to, learn what's needed in order to become a teacher, and how, starting from that position, you then a much more sort of individual level sort of educate, the educative process that enables them to achieve those aims. And knowledge is an important part of that, but it's not necessarily driven by the knowledge. And maybe both, neither of them really hits the mark. And I don't think we've, I think some of us might have an idea of what a better approach might be. But the other thing to say is that, I think time has shown that none of these models are of themselves sufficient, that they may be effective to a certain extent, but they're not going to do the job if you see the sort of teacher you want to produce as being a rounded professional. So I think it's all about professionalism as well.
It's fun to think about these other professions, isn't it? And the way that they the way that they learn. We can all think about terrified junior doctors, trailing in the wake of some terrifying consultant who's hitting them with questions, all that kind of thing. It's been that way for time immemorial, as you said, and with lawyers and professions like that. I can imagine you could make an argument that actually it would be no bad thing for one's signature pedagogy to evolve over the centuries, perhaps slightly more than medicine or the law might have done. But the argument that you're making, you and your co-authors making, is that it's not that it's evolved, it's that it's completely incoherent and there's lots of things going on at the same time. We haven't got a straight story. I wondered if you had any sense of why it is that teacher education can't get its story straight. Is it that learning to be a teacher is just so very, very complicated? Is it that nobody spent the time to think about it? Is it that teachers themselves can't agree on it?
Okay. Before I answer that, just to say, you mentioned co-authors, and the paper was co-authored by Claire Brooks, who was at University College London, the Institute of Education at the time, and is now at the University of Cambridge, and Joanna McIntyre, who's at the University of Nottingham. So just to make sure they get the shout out, as well, because I'm sure they're going to be listening.
No pressure.
I think it is because of the complexity of teaching, and I think it's not quite necessary for all other professions. But the example you mentioned of that sort of clinical practice model and of a trainee doctor learning from, the expert through the rounds and through the ward rounds of that sort of that context. There is just one, let's call them a client. I mean, it's not a client or customer, but there is one recipient. If you're learning about law, you are generally representing the case of one person, or, it's all one case. The thing about teaching is that every day, classrooms, you're teaching whole groups of children, probably 30 odd children, maybe a bit fewer than that, but it's roughly and they are coming from such diverse backgrounds, interests, they are so different. And it's, what was it? Walter Doyle talked about the multidimensionality, the simultaneity, and the unpredictability of classrooms. So, there's loads and loads going on. And he gives the example of a teacher carrying out just a question and answer session with the children, and what that teacher has to attend to cognitively and physically in terms of managing that discussion is incredibly complex. And then it's the simultaneity. There are lots of things going on all at the same time. It's not like you deal with one thing and then you deal with the next thing and then you deal with the next thing. And the unpredictability, even if you could have, you could control all of that and develop the skills to be, manage brilliantly a question and answer session and juggle all of these things that are going on at the same time, then the door opens and something odd happens, or somebody knocks on the door, say you've all got to go off to assembly now, or something happens on the field outside where you're looking out of the window. And, so there's all of this. And it's also the unpredictability of children within the classroom. Suddenly somebody giving an answer that opens up all sorts of possibilities of exploring those from an educational purpose, but I really need to get on because I've got to cover this in the lessons. So, and that's what Tim Rowlands and his colleagues, when they talk about the knowledge quartet, the knowledge that teachers need. They talk about this contingency knowledge, being able to react in the moment. It's not dealing with off-task behavior in the moment. It's actually dealing with sort of intellectually with something that arises in the lesson or something a child says, and having to be able to process quickly how you respond to that, and, in an educative way. So there's all of that going on, the unpredictability. Somebody could suddenly say something that opens up this enormous possibility. So what teachers have to do then is to make judgments in the moment. And every single one of those judgments has an ethical dimension to it, because it makes a difference. That if you shut that child down and say, "It's fine, but we're not talking about that now," then that has an effect on how I've just said that to Tom. Tom's going to, he might say, "Well, it's fine, completely," or he might say, "Right, well, I'm not going to bother out saying anything again," and then it's slightly altered the way that Tom sees me, sees the subject, sees the lesson, sees his peers, that sort of thing. So all of these ethical decisions. And the other thing about teaching is that it's highly relational. It's all dependent on relationships. So how you have a signature pedagogy to prepare teachers for that type of work, and that's not unusual. This is happening every single day. It's happening this moment, in tens of thousands of classrooms. There are teachers doing this in an incredibly competent way, managing all of these things. But I think that's what makes it different, that it's that multidimensionality, simultaneity, and unpredictability of the classroom.
And I was just reflecting as you were talking then and thinking that what you were sort of demonstrating through what you were saying there is your understanding perhaps of the implicit, your perspective on the implicit structure of what it means to become a teacher. I sort of get a sense of what you value. It seems to me from what you've described that, you value the teacher's kind of cognitive work that they are doing in the moment, that they need to be reflecting, that they need to see pupils as individuals. And the article sort of deals with this and then makes a connection to, you know, if you think differently to that, if you think that actually research says that there are techniques that actually will work for everybody. So we don't need to, and therefore teacher education and maybe like the surface structure of that, so the recognizable acts of learning to teach, might be that I will show you research informed techniques, I will model them, you will then have a go at them yourself. And you know, just know, because research says, and I'm being really reductive here, but let's go with it, just know that research says these will work for every class, and largely you'll do these with all your classes and you'll get good results. There's a different implicit structure there. And I wonder if this is another part of the problem, that education more broadly, will everybody agree if you ask them over a pint on, you know, what is the purpose of education? Gert Biester talks about, you know, it's this balancing act between orientations towards qualification, subjectification and socialisation. You know, am I developing the human in front of me? Is it all about getting that qualification because they'll have cultural capital and it's going to get them a job at the end of the day? And perhaps, again, this is, maybe we don't do enough sort of round table work together as a profession of teacher educators to say, okay, what are our shared attitudes, values, dispositions about what it means to be a teacher? Can we even agree? You know, in the current climate of teacher retention crisis, I can understand how an argument might be formulated. I won't agree with it, but an implicit structure being, actually, no, we need to get them in the profession. We need to get them in there quickly because we're in a crisis. So the best way to do that is to apprenticeship model, or to, you know, just give them the techniques, off they go.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to argue against the fact that teachers have to be able to do certain things efficiently in the classroom, and that those things have to be learnt, and often they're techniques that need to be practiced in order to be learnt. So then you develop some sort of automaticity in you know, and they're often, I think, you know, quite generic aspects of teaching, and they can be practiced. So that's sort of the core practices type approach, and, you know, the whole view of instructional coaching, that you do this, and that's at the heart of this sort of new intensive training and practice, these 4 weeks that have to be included, that you understand a bit about the issue, you see teachers doing this, you model it yourself, you get feedback, you keep practicing, you get more feedback, and then you get better. So I wouldn't deny at all that there are some aspects. And yes, that argument that as long as they can do some of these things, if a lot of the content has been predetermined and teachers are relying on pre-planned lessons, I don't know what it's like in Wales, but in England there is a much greater move now. A lot of teachers are not planning their lessons because they're done for them. The PowerPoint slides are prepared, the lessons are all planned, and that's a response to a workload issue. So if the lesson has been prepared and planned and structured, you have the technical skills to deliver that content, then yes, you know, you can see that that's an argument. And then why would you might even need a qualified teacher to do that? You know, you can. I think, you know, it worries me that might be a logical extension of what you've just said. But I think it comes back to it was a paper that Chris Winch and Alice Wancher and Janet Orchard wrote for the BERA RSA inquiry, and 10 years ago now. And then it was published in, I think, 2015, 2016, the Oxford Review of Education. And their argument is that it's a philosophical paper, and it's saying there are different conceptualizations of the teacher, and that teachers, and they relate it to Aristotelian terminology, which I'm not going to go into now because I'm not a philosopher and I don't understand Aristotle closely enough, but that teachers need craft knowledge and they need technical knowledge, But those two alone are not sufficient. That there has to be another dimension and to make them the full professional, and that involves reflection, engagement with research, understanding, the complexity of teaching, and but essentially having the capacity to reflect on their own practice, drawing on different sources in order to inform their professional development. And you can see without that, then we end up with teachers who, yes, you give them a manual and they can follow the manual, and that's fine. So I'm not saying those things are not important. What I'm saying is they're not sufficient in themselves. So you could, but then I worry, that I may be completely wrong about, well, sometimes I don't wake up in the night worrying about it because I'm not that sad. But I do worry sometimes, what if we're wrong in all of this, and that actually, what would teaching look like? If actually we had people, who could do all these things efficiently, that maybe there are educational experts whom we used to call teachers who prepare the materials, and people deliver those materials, and children at the end, are successful with their outcomes in terms, if you measure the outcomes by, how much they've retained, and that would be tested in external assessments, and it would make life a lot simpler. But I don't think then we could argue for teaching as a profession at all.
No.
Because there would be, what would the professional knowledge base be?
It's not substantial enough. It sounds like a dystopian world to me.
Well, it does sound, it's a worry. I mean, it's the implicit structure that's interesting, isn't it? I was musing as you were talking about the fact that two teachers in two different schools may meet over a pint and not actually agree on everything in their implicit structure. I mean, obviously the teaching profession has an awful lot that is shared in terms of morals and attitudes and values and that kind of thing. But one of the things that's really struck me as my student teachers have started filtering back from the beginnings of their school placements, they're able to tell me very perceptively, I see this thing going on and I'm quite surprised, but I understand it's because of this. For example, you've placed me, Tom, in a school where loads of the kids don't speak English as a first language. They've had an incredibly hard time. Some of them have landed direct from war zones. Somebody else on the other side of the room is saying, you've put me in a really, really high-flying, hot housing school where the parents have spent tons of money buying a house in catchment and expect some high grades. Those schools, for better or worse, are going to have slight quirks in their differences in their implicit structure. The students will tell me, so our implicit structure as teacher educators needs to be, because we're kind of meta, because we're teaching teachers to be teachers, has to be broad enough and multi-layered enough to yes, have some hard boundaries around stuff that's absolutely non-negotiable, but also to be able to cope with those different implicit structures, and also cope with the fact that the students, those who are learning to be teachers, will spend most of their time with a teacher in school looking after them who's absolutely steeped in just one implicit structure. And how do we manage that?
Yeah, it's tricky. But it's by enabling the teachers to be able to stand back and make sense of that by drawing on different sources of knowledge, not just the knowledge of that one context. So if they move to another context, that they're thrown, that they appreciate that there are more general, more underpinning, sort of, we call them theories, approaches that they can draw on, but that in that context, so for example, I'm a modern linguist, so we, in our curriculum program, subject program for the PGC, would talk to them about different theories of language acquisition, the value of using the target language in the classroom, that sort of thing. They go into a school where, say, their mentor says, you can't do that here. They can't use the target language here. It just won't work. So there are a few responses to that. Either, okay, I accept that in this context, but it doesn't mean that I then think no children can ever use the target language in any context. I have to then think, well, I've read this, I've heard about this, we've talked about it, and I'm now experiencing a context. Or I might say, well, how about with that year 9 group I've got? Could I just try it out? Or try it with the year 7s? Could I just do a bit of that so you could test it out in the school? Or you might say, actually, that isn't going to happen in this context. But if I go to another school, I could have a different approach. And you go to another school, and then something you brought from the context of the first school in a different area, that does work perfectly well there, that isn't even a feature of the practice in the second school, you think, oh, by the way, in my other school, they did this. Could I try that? So it's actually not assuming that there is one answer, that it is, that it's so contextually dependent. And again, I think that's what makes it different from other professions, that you have to have a repertoire, and you have to be able to make sense of the teaching by taking account of the different alternatives before you make the decision. And that contextual information will be hugely important for you in that, but it won't determine necessarily the teacher you're going to be forever. Yeah.
But and I suppose the problem there is that there is a clash for the student teacher who believes that and hears that and feels that, who then is working with a teacher educator who could be in a university or could be in a school, and hasn't done the thinking around the implicit structure of the model that is being used, and therefore has a clash of worldviews over this. And is sort of then left to navigate their way through that. I'm very, very self-aware when I'm saying this, because as you know, and as I'll tell our listeners now, we're doing some work in the Cardiff Partnership where I'm based around mentoring practice and working with mentors as teacher educators. And, even though we are in a clinical practice model of teacher education here, we cannot assume that our mentors, even that everybody at Cardiff Met who's a university tutor on this programme, is wedded to, fully understands and believes in the implicit structure of what it means to be and learn to become a teacher in a research-informed clinical practice model. And so, an example being, we really tell our student teachers, question everything, go out into school. And Tom's given an example of how his students have come back and they're really thinking in that way. But then if their mentor at the end of the day is the person that will confer qualified teacher status, then are they going to feel empowered to, or even able to, question if they're, your example, is, can I try out this approach, even though their mentor has said, well, no, that's not going to work here. So it strikes me, and the conclusion really hammers this home, that the work that you do thinking about this implicit structure is almost where the magic happens. The surface structure is surface. It's the point-at-able, visible acts of, it's how you see it happen in practice. But the work that really seems to be sort of the thing that makes it land or not land is the implicit structure. And I just wonder how much work various models do and people within them, because it's all about those people. You say it's relational, do to get their head straight on that.
Yeah, it's
not easy.
No, it's not easy at all. And what it does is throw the responsibility fully onto the student teacher or the pre-service teacher, and as if they don't have enough to deal with. You're now saying, now you've got to make sense of it all, because in order to develop, and I think that has been a critique of, the practical theorising model that, that is at the heart of the sort of programme in Oxford, our PGCE programme, that it's a lot of responsibility. But I think it's a profession unless you ask people to take that level of responsibility for their own learning as well. So it's equipping them as well. I think it's empowering teachers. It's not just, oh, here's more stuff for you to do. You've also now got to make sense of it, because we can't make sense of it, because each context will be different. So there is a lot of sort of recontextualizing of everything that they told and hear and see and do at the individual level. But that equips them then to be able to take responsibility for their own professional learning and to identify the areas that they may want to explore further in their teaching, and also to have enough understanding to be able to set the criteria by which they're going to evaluate how successful or not that work has been as they're trying to move their teaching forward. It's about it, but it's an intellectual process, not just about the practice. But it is. It's not easy. It's complicated, and I keep coming, as you're talking, keep coming back to is it any easier to training to be a lawyer or training to be a doctor or an engineer or whatever? In some ways, yes. Probably in a lot of ways, no.
Thinking about people who might be listening to this who are serving teachers and perhaps school-based teacher educators, as we're kind of maybe bringing our musings towards a close. I always like to throw some goodies out to those people. We've talked about, you've just talked about there, about how student teachers are in a difficult place for all the reasons that you just said. I guess university-based teacher educators have their own disadvantages. Thinking about what we were talking about earlier, you were talking about Doyle's work, about how complicated it is to be a teacher. And we sort of know that one of the ways that you actually deal with that complexity as a serving teacher, chucking enormous numbers of lessons out of the door every day, is to pack it up into something that becomes almost unconscious. We often compare it to learning to drive, and that it's quite difficult to actually unpack that again for students, because a lot of this stuff we've been talking about has become internalized purely out of a kind of survival thing. And also we've talked about the fact that school-based teacher educators are in a context. They're very much rooted in a context where certain things happen and certain things work, and it's very neat for that school-based teacher educator. Do we have any advice for school-based teacher educators to almost counteract some of those things, that while they're a great advantage for being a teacher, they are potentially a slight disadvantage for being a teacher educator?
Yes, because I suppose being a teacher educator in a school, if we're talking about pedagogy, signature pedagogies, it's entirely recognizable. Like teaching in schools has its, recognizable, if you call it signature pedagogy, I know classrooms differ, but basically approaches are similar, what teachers do, and, the deep implicit layers of that, etc. for, most people. If you're a teacher educator in a school, that's a completely different signature pedagogy. You're not going to put your trainee teachers in front of you and cold call them about X, Y, or Z, and then give them a test at the end, or start with the same PowerPoint every time for recall. And that it's a completely different approach. So I think it is a challenge. The other challenge for, I think, school-based teacher educators is so much of what you've just talked about is implicit knowledge, and it's very, very hard to articulate it. And we were talking yesterday about, again, it's the student teacher who has to be able to ask the right sort of questions to get at why a teacher made a particular judgment in the moment. But that's what they need to know. What were you thinking about at that moment? So, it's almost like us being a school-based teacher educator, a mentor, a senior mentor, or whatever. means stepping out of your classroom teaching role. So that means you've got two roles in school as well. And I would say it's enriching and empowering, and but it's not a natural role. And that's why, teachers who move over to teacher education, be it within a more formalized way in a skit context, or moving over to university, the transition is really, really difficult because you're working in a different paradigm. But that's true of mentors as well. I think that it's understanding, the role and the power of mentoring and the educative role of mentoring that is so exciting a role to have in a school. It is absolutely, I think the perfect role.
Yeah, so I'm just reflecting on the sort of the level of metacognition that is in play when you are a teacher educator. Having to ask myself, how did I come to be like this? Why do I do it that way? And why did I do it like that in that moment? And I've seen this in my relationships with mentors, drama mentors that I work really closely with on the programme, who have had the privilege of taking some of my student teachers to observe teach live in a classroom scenario. And you've got the beauty there when you're working in that partnership of being able to sort of know what the student teachers are picking up on live in the moment, and be able to ask those questions of the teacher either just immediately after or... So that it really is a role to consider if you want to take yourself to the sort of the next step, and to think even more deeply about your teaching practice. Then teacher education and thinking about that might be a really great progression route for you. I can't sell that role of a school-based teacher educator enough, even though we know there are issues sometimes with time and space to do that role. But if you're thinking about taking the plunge, hopefully what we've said today will convince you to pursue that role. Okay, we have taken a deep dive into signature pedagogies and the world of, I'm going to say ITE, and
yes.
Whoever
Proudly
wants to can come after
around
me.
here rather than trainers.
Now, Trevor, we have asked you, as we ask all of our guests, to prepare 2 short slots for us, something interesting and something to try. Would you like to decide which one you'd like to share with our listeners first?
Yes, I've been thinking about this a bit, and I think I want to pick up because it's relevant to the discussion we've just had. I've been doing some work on a book that a colleague of mine is editing about mentoring in modern languages. It's part of the Routledge series. And in doing some research for that chapter, it's specifically about modern languages mentoring, but actually a lot of what we've written is about generic approaches to mentoring within a modern languages context. I don't think there actually is an awful lot specifically about, there are bits because it's about responding to the student teachers, knowledge, their underlying beliefs about the value of target language, this sort of thing. But, and I was just thinking, there's an article I read by Helen Trevethan that was really, really useful in talking about different types of mentoring and different levels of mentoring. And this reflects the work, other people have written about this as well. But, and this whole notion of educative mentoring, and I think it ties in nicely with what we've just been talking about. Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay. And you're something to try.
Well, it's almost like saying, just try something. That sounds very odd, but actually, teaching in a school, I think there's a lot of sort of noise around research and inquiry, and it's sometimes you label these things and the label then becomes unhelpful because it's interpreted as being something that it isn't. And so, and I've heard, a lot of the times when I've been in Wales that people say, oh, that's research inquiry, oh, that's what happens there. So I'm, in a separate box, or that's for other people. And I would say that in any classroom, there is always something, a little niggle about something that you just would like to sort out in your teaching, and to take that inquiry stance and just think, I'm not going to tell anybody about it. I'm not going to read all of the literature and then I'm going to frame a study. None of that stuff at all. We're not talking. We're just to think about what it is that you want to work on. See what other people think about that. Maybe read a little bit around it, and then just try it out over, I would say, a long enough period for it to work. So, if, for example, you're a modern languages teacher, you think, I really do want to, I keep going back to this, but it's probably because it's an easy example to pick. I'm going to try with my Year 7 class over the next month to introduce more target language into the classroom. Then I'm just going to see what the effects of this have been, but I'm going to try it out. Nobody need know about it. It's not, and then if it works, I might tell my colleagues about it. I might share it more widely. But to see your practice as being enriched by inquiry.
And just before we go then, let's give a name check to the article again, in case you want to have a read and you want to have a dig into what it is to learn to be a teacher. There's plenty in there for everybody, I would say, who's involved in teacher education, student teacher onwards. It's Learning to Think, Perform and Act with Integrity. Does teacher education have a signature pedagogy and why does this matter? By Claire Brooks, Joanna McIntyre and our guest Trevor Mutton, and it's published open access in the London Review of Education.
Professor Trevor Mutton, we got you at last. We will hopefully have you on again at some point, given that you've got a lot going on. And perhaps there's an episode in the making on mentoring modern languages, maybe in tandem with Kerry Bevan. All right. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. We'll be back with you in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. The special guest this episode was Professor Trevor Mutton from the University of Oxford, and thanks to Trevor for joining us in our studio today. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blanford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. Technical support from Peter Lamburn and the studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.